Cosmic Awakening, 1991. Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. By Makāula Nakae. Episode 3, Out on a Limb. Through my life-fighting illness, I learned many things from books. Meditation methods, the 7 chakras aligned along the spine and their roles, the potential of visual healing to direct the body toward recovery using visual imagery, nutrition, and spiritual meanings. It was a veritable parade of concepts. As if possessed, I blindly devoured various books, eventually arriving at the channeled entity Bashar, who was recording bestseller status at the time. I felt considerable resistance toward the expression universal consciousness. Even while feeling intrigued, I couldn't shake off a sense of the unfathomable. Every time I saw the spine of a Bashar book, I kept hesitating, unable to pick one up for quite a long time. However, when I finally mustered the courage to pick up a Bashar book, it once again drastically transformed my awareness. I liked the content of the Bashar books so much that I continued reading related works one after another and devoured various books concerning universal consciousness. I suppose it was because the Bashar books used an easy-to-understand colloquial style and provided information on concrete methods to change the reality I was experiencing at that time, which I could grasp very smoothly. However, living in a regional town like Quito, Kyushu back then and facing financial constraints due to my illness, the first time I actually experienced channeling right before my eyes was the channeling of Edward Mabe and Jaziwa conducted during the Peru trip. The trigger that made me decide to join the Peru tour was the television movie adapted from the aforementioned book Out on a Limb by Shirley, MacLaine. For the healing of my liver, I had been performing chakra healing meditation daily while watching her video. Then, at a video rental shop, I found the video of the movie version of Out on a Limb. I rented it immediately and watched Volume 1 with great interest in the VCR. As I switched to the second volume and the opening scene began to play, a terrible headache, unlike anything I had ever experienced, started up. Then, as my body began to vibrate subtly, a powerful sensation arose, as if I were being pulled out from the top of my head. If I relaxed even a little bit, it felt as though I would slip right out of my body and get dragged off somewhere. It might have been a sort of out-of-body phenomenon, an experience where consciousness separates from the physical body while remaining completely awake. Caught in an inexplicable headache and a sensation of being pulled, I couldn't stop watching the video. An itchy, tingling sensation appeared almost right in the center of my forehead, the area known as the third eye. And as these strange sensations continued, I kept watching. Then, at the very threshold where my consciousness was about to pop right out of my physical body, a wave of terror surged. In my heart, I cried out, "Please stop, it's scary," clinging desperately to my body and wishing hard. As a result, an out-of-body separation did not occur, and I finished watching the video to the end. It was a pulling energy so powerful it could be called a gravitational suction from heaven. Looking back now, I feel it was a huge missed opportunity. After that strange video experience, only a single thought crossed my mind. I don't really understand, but I absolutely have to go to Peru in a sense. That radical and sudden spiritual experience was the decisive catalyst that compelled me to head to Peru. My conversation with the tour conductor progressed along these lines. While flight times usually feel relatively long, as I listened to my own story and his experiences as described above, we arrived in San Jose before we even knew it. The breeze of San Jose as I stepped down the mobile stairs from the plane, the harsh midday sunlight, made my eyes sting. But the air was dry, free of humidity, and felt wonderfully crisp. Visiting the soil of California had been a dream of mine since I was around 17 or 18. Deep down, I used to think it was a rather ordinary dream, yet it was a yearning place that continually captured my heart. The primary reason dated back to junior high when I was a competitive swimmer. My coach once floated the idea of taking me and another girl to Long Beach for a swimming camp study abroad program. Before my mother could even tell me about it, the other girl's mother declined. So my mother declined too. When I found out later, it was a massive shock, an experience where everything seemed to fall out from under me. Some time after I began working at my first design office, while gazing at a blank layout sheet spread across my desk, a certain landscape suddenly flashed vividly into my mind. A crystal blue sky appeared, and I was looking up from below at a cluster of palm trees, piercing straight into that sky. I clearly remember the scent of the breeze being exceptionally distinct. That magical fragrance enveloped my body and lingered for about half day. While I was inside that mental landscape, the air felt completely different. And for a while afterward, it still felt as though I were living inside a pocket of California, right in the middle of Japan. I went straight to a nearby travel agency to look into California tour packages, and even went so far as to visit the U.S. consulate in Fukuoka to ask how I could immigrate to America. Ever since I saw that parade of palm trees, California's blue sky had become my land of Canaan. I strongly felt that I might have lived in that place once long ago, and I was convinced that the secret key to my life might be waiting there. Though I had finally arrived in this long-awaited land of Canaan, I couldn't understand at all whether San Jose was truly my dream California. Yet perhaps aided by the sense of standing on an extension of the yearning land and the feeling of open-air freedom, breathing felt remarkably easy. Gathering my courage during the transit layover, I stepped outside the airport terminal. The other tour participants were basking in the sunlight, lying on the wide lawn, chatting and relaxing. I remember the sudden feeling of reality sinking in. I'm going to Peru with these people. The journey had only just begun. At that point, I couldn't have anticipated or imagined that their presence would come to occupy such a large place in my life. Once you grow up, enter society, and take on the hyper-demanding profession of a designer, the chances of meeting kindred spirits outside of work circles are virtually non-existent. Sitting outside the airport, soaking in the California sunshine while watching some of the participants, what struck me was that I had never known people who could express themselves so freely. It felt so refreshing to see them breathing the American air freely, completely unconcerned about the eyes of others or the judgment of anyone else. One of the greatest wonders of spiritually oriented tours is the shared travel experience. You get to meet all kinds of people, and friends sharing the same wavelength suddenly multiply all at once. Upon returning to the cavernous airport waiting room, my next encounter was with Tadashi, who would become my roommate during the trip. I was a regional advertising designer. He was an active video cameraman based in Tokyo. Perhaps because we shared similar professions, or perhaps due to his friendly and cheerful personality, we hit it off relatively quickly in a rather curious turn of events. From that moment until the very end of the Peru trip, we remained inseparable. He got to observe my experiences and transformations from the closest vantage point possible, becoming a living witness to the various events that unfolded in that mysterious land called Peru. Night in Los Angeles airport was vast. Beyond the baggage claim area and the meeting spot with our tour leader and channeler, Edward Mabe, I could see the blue sky and palm trees swaying lightly in the breeze. Mr. Edward was a tall, heavily built man with a commanding presence. Before becoming a channeler, he had apparently worked as a music producer in Hollywood. Back then, he visited Japan frequently and was a fairly well-known channeler worldwide. My first impression of Edward, who helped us with hotel check-in, was that he felt like an utterly ordinary American young man, no different from anyone else. Travels that involve spiritual exploration seem prone to various accidents, and our trip to Peru was no exception. As an opening act, the room key of one of the rare pairs of men on our tour suddenly stopped working. After various efforts by the hotel staff, it culminated into an unprecedented major commotion where they had to drill the door lock apart and replace it with a new one. Having no knowledge of New Age or spiritual matters at the time, Tadashi and I watched this absurd yet comical scene unfold, holding our sides with laughter. The key showed no sign of opening whatsoever, and at the stage where they were removing the lock with a drill, the deafening noise made the children in the next room start crying, while a guest in another room began screaming in fury. It escalated into quite a remarkable spectacle. Looking back now, I believe that massive commotion over the door key was largely triggered by their internal changes. Events like losing a key or replacing it with a new one can generally be called symbolic occurrences that frequently manifest during the transition into a new state of consciousness, amidst the shift from a familiar, old reality into a new one. A life where you cannot lock doors, a life without secrets. Not being able to hide inner desires, wanting to lock things away, yet having them forced open, having to swap out the key, it seemed to symbolize that kind of reality. Starting with that incident, various events of varying scales occurred throughout the tour. The charm of a spiritual journey lies in experiencing such surreal occurrences, while in a heightened state of awakened awareness. Such events transform the journey itself into something deeply impressive and thrilling, making every single moment vibrant and upbeat. When you lose yourself in the fun, reality becomes intensely vivid, brimming with humor and love as time flies by in an instant. What exists there is not heaviness or darkness, but joy, positivity, shared empathy, deep emotion, expansion, lightness, and velocity. After those various happenings, Tadashi and I quickly finished our preparations for the following day and turned in. Exhausted from the long journey across the Pacific, we fell fast asleep without a single struggle. However, I woke up wide awake past 4 a.m. and couldn't fall back asleep. After staring blankly at the ceiling, lying on my back for a while, I gave up, changed clothes quietly to avoid making noise, and left the room to catch a glimpse of the morning scenery in Los Angeles. Looking out over the hotel from the stair landing, amidst a humid morning air different from the daytime, palm trees were fantastically tinted red under the glow of neon signs. As the wind blew aimlessly, I looked up at the sky on a whim, but no stars were visible. Passing through the semi-subterranean parking lot out to the back alley, the blue asphalt pathways familiar from American movies I had watched in the past were waiting there, appearing to stretch endlessly into the horizon, soaked in cold morning dew. Then a black figure suddenly appeared, startling me into turning around. The shadow turned out to be an older couple of Caucasians who sped away in a red sports car. The time had come for travelers who had healed their travel fatigue to set off toward their next destination once more. And I myself was no different from a mere traveler stopping by for a brief rest. Before long, the cold, blue Los Angeles morning air before sunrise gradually gathered warmth, and the gray, cloudy sky grew brighter and paler, hinting at the promise of dawn. To Lima via Miami. We boarded the bus just past 6:30 a.m. and headed for the airport. The plane to our next layover destination, Miami, ascended into the brilliantly glowing light pouring forth alongside the rising sun, flying straight through a pure white sky bound for Miami. Waiting for nearly 2 hours for our connecting flight to Lima at the Miami Transit Hub, Tadashi and I explored the expansive airport alongside other participants, discussing the spiritual world as well as our respective experiences and happenings. Tadashi shared that his primary motivation for choosing the tour to Peru was an extraordinary fascination with hyper-ancient civilizations, such as those of Peru, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Around that time, humanity was finally beginning to view the relationships among humans, the cosmos, ancient history, and spiritual consciousness within a unified relative context. The transit time passed in the blink of an eye, and once we boarded the plane bound for Lima, it felt as though we had practically arrived at our destination. The plane departed Miami on schedule in the late afternoon. Because takeoff occurred near dusk, the scenery outside the window slowly dyed itself in twilight. The light blue sky above gradually took on a hint of pink before transforming into a vivid orange. A thick mass of clouds lay directly beneath the aircraft, and the sky visible through the small window was a completely transparent, cloudless world of pure orange. It felt as though the space outside the plane could no longer be called the sky, but rather the atmosphere itself. The light of the sunset pouring through the small windows aligned in a row dyed the cabin in a fantastical singular shade of orange, and everyone shared that moment holding their breath. At that time, we were flying high above the majestic, dense jungles of the Amazon, and the setting sun was burning crimson at the horizon. Then, the orange light gradually deepened in redness, turning the universe into a deep crimson. A universe of bright red, pure crimson fire. Wondering if astronauts drifting through the infinite star sea of the cosmos also experienced this kind of pure sunset magic, my heart trembled. Staying in orbit around the Earth, they continued to experience sunrise and sunset, roughly every 90 minutes. Astronauts have reported deep spiritual experiences and heightened awareness of the divine presence when viewing the Earth from space. This phenomenon, known as the overview effect, is said to evoke a profound sense of unity and connection with all of humanity. Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell stated that he felt a deep dissatisfaction with the current state of the world, one that evolved further from an instantaneous global consciousness, and was driven by a strong impulse to improve it. He emphasized the contrast between the triviality of international politics and the majestic view of the Earth from the moon. Apollo 11's Buzz Aldrin performed a communion service on the moon and, prior to stepping onto the lunar surface, sought a few minutes of silence for personal meditation and gratitude. During this time, he reaffirmed his unity with the Church and his connection to the Christian community, strengthening his faith. Apollo 15's James Irwin also reported a spiritual awakening, noting that being on the moon had a profound impact on his life. He shared that his mission was ordained by God, and upon returning to Earth, he began sharing his Christian faith more openly. The experience of space travel likely elevates their spiritual consciousness and grants them a new perspective on life and the universe. Before long, the crimson universe before our eyes began to tinge with purple, passing through indigo to become a flawless blue cosmos where the morning star shined. And we had become undeniable star travelers, journeying through that blue, flawless universe. The first UFO sighting from an airplane window. As if foreshadowing the events that would unfold throughout this journey to Peru, I witnessed a UFO from inside the airplane at this very moment. Since we were about an hour away from arriving in Lima, the aircraft should still have been flying at a considerable altitude. Thinking we had only about an hour left, my mind grew strangely calm, and I began to feel a vague sense of unfulfillment. The man sitting next to me had Walkman earphones in his ears. I couldn't tell whether he was asleep or awake. Casually glancing out the window, I saw a sky blanketed broadly with clouds, and upon looking closer, I spotted an orange light near the tip of the wing. That large sphere of light was moving alongside the airplane. At first, I assumed it was simply a lamp attached to the wingtip, but as I watched it for a while, it gradually began to ascend diagonally in the direction of travel, which struck me as rather strange. After all, I couldn't think of any vehicle capable of moving faster than an airplane at such a high altitude while also traveling diagonally. Turning around to look at the man beside me, he appeared to be sleeping as usual, eyes closed, listening to music. Feeling somewhat reassured by his profile, I looked toward the window once more, and the orange luminous body from earlier was back at its initial position on the wingtip. Perhaps this is what they commonly call a UFO, I thought for a mere fraction of a second, but having never seen such a thing before. And with my mental image of a UFO being something that zipped around at high speed in zigzags with a whizzing sound, I couldn't be certain. Even before feeling surprised, the feeling that something here is strange was much stronger. Pressing my face even closer to the window, I caught sight of a female passenger's face from the tour in the row behind me to the right, and I whispered to her, "Hey, there's something weird flying outside the window. Come take a look." She seemed to notice it as well, and the two of us continued watching in silence. Then, that orange luminous body began rising straight up in the direction of travel at the same speed. After exchanging glances in silence once more, we looked back out the window. What had previously gone upward had returned after a moment, and this time it slowly descended in the opposite direction of our travel. Keeping my eyes fixed on the window, I said, "Hey, whether we like it or not, isn't that a UFO?" "I've never seen one before, so I don't know," she replied in a similarly deflated tone, as she had never seen one either. "Yeah, I've never seen one before either, so I don't know." As the two of us stood dumbfounded, continuing to gaze out the window at the dazzling, continually glowing sphere of mysterious light, that orange luminous body returned once more. It flew alongside the airplane for a short while, but then dropped back behind us and completely vanished from our field of vision. Remaining glued to the window without understanding what had happened, we sat in silence and stared blankly out for a while. After a short time, realizing that the UFO was unlikely to return, I said, "That really must have been a UFO, huh?" She gave a deflated reply, accompanied by another weak smile. "Right. I don't really get it, but let's just leave it at that." The mysterious phenomenon outside the window was so detached from reality that, even though my mind could faintly imagine it, the reality of it wouldn't fully sink in. I had only looked at it. I hadn't touched it. It was outside the window. Moreover, it was a phenomenon high in the sky, giving it a thin sense of reality. What did it mean that it could move at the same speed as an airplane or even faster? It really was a UFO, right? It couldn't possibly be anything else, right? But, keeping my mouth shut and thinking to myself for a while, I regretted not telling the others about it. but since it was already water under the bridge, I stopped thinking and regretting it any further. While I was pondering this and that, the plane approached the airspace above Lima, and the city lights of Lima began to appear faintly through a break in the clouds. Before long, at an altitude where the entire city became clearly visible, the long runway lined with beautifully glowing approach lights stretched out horizontally below. The aircraft landed at the international airport right on schedule at 10:10 p.m., as if being sucked into the glittering neon lights of Lima. Midnight at Lima Airport. When we arrived in Lima, the capital of Peru, the airport area was shrouded in mist, making the orange cocktail lights look hazy and a size larger. As we walked down the mobile stairs and through the thin fog, the air felt heavily saturated with moisture, making it immediately clear that the ocean was close by. The surroundings were permeated by a strong smell of fish. Although fishing yields had been poor around that time, the city is famous for its anchovies. The time difference from Japan was 14 hours. A midnight airport felt deeply fantastical, making me feel as though I were swimming like a fish through a dream. After clearing immigration and stepping out into the terminal, it was so overflowing with people and luggage, leaving not an inch of free floor space, that it looked like a morning market. There were ordinary solo travelers, family travelers, and what surprised me most were several families piling up mountains of baggage so massive that they looked as if they were traveling with all the furniture from their homes. It was hard to believe that families were migrating into this crisis-stricken city, and much like the age of exploration stories one watches in movies, seeing people wait while holding onto multiple trunks large enough for a person to comfortably fit inside made me wonder where on earth they were headed next. I couldn't tell whether these travelers were immigrants or simply wealthy tourists. Certainly, this country of immigrants combining mist from the sea and winds from the desert must have once been the gateway to the glittering golden El Dorado. Were they still coming to this country in search of gold? Imagining the illusions of such a golden age, what struck me was that we, having arrived in the city that once prospered in gold long ago, were not aiming for a material golden El Dorado, but rather the El Dorado shining brightly within the heart. Until a few years prior, the country had been under martial law, and even after returning from Peru, I never heard rumors that its economy had improved. Just before our trip, a Japanese man had been murdered simply for being Japanese. The bus sent by the hotel to pick us up was an old season tour bus that could hardly be called high-end, and it felt a little dusty. That might have been due to the dry desert climate. When I checked later, Lima's climate in May is generally warm and dry. The average maximum temperature is around 24 degrees Celsius, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average minimum is around 16 degrees Celsius, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, making it relatively cool with no extreme heat or cold. May falls within Lima's dry season, characterized by very little precipitation and practically no rainfall. Humidity tends to be high, often hovering around 80%, with mist frequently forming especially in mornings and evenings. The wind is gentle with almost no strong gusts, and cool breezes blow in from the ocean. Sunrise in May is around 6:15 a.m. and sunset is around 6 p.m., providing about 12 hours of daylight. Overall, May in Lima is described as a comfortable climate and a suitable season for sightseeing and outdoor activities. So while I went without knowing any of that, climatologically speaking, it turned out to be the best time of year for a stay. Having finally arrived in Lima after a continuous string of very long transits, I pressed my face against the vehicle window and gazed blankly outside, worn out from travel fatigue and the lateness of the hour. While listening to the guide's instructions regarding our stay in Lima amidst the state, the bus passed through a simple checkpoint and began making its way toward the city center, where our hotel was located. The zones illuminated here and there by lighting equipment felt somewhat similar to the downtown area of Okinawa that I had visited on my high school senior trip. The desolate glow of neon tubes undeniably and vividly narrated the devastating condition of Peru at that time. The cracked stucco walls were stained with dust, and words shaping thoughts of freedom were scribbled in large letters with paint and spray cans, looking like frantic graffiti. Passing through such desolate streets where it was impossible to tell whether buildings were homes or storefronts, we arrived at the hotel entrance about 20 minutes after leaving the airport. What surprised me first was that tourists visiting this country and staying downtown seemed so remarkably unsafe that, upon arriving at the hotel, guards carrying machine guns stood rigidly on both sides of the glass entrance, like guardian Neo statues. Witnessing a situation completely unimaginable in Japan gave me a slight sense of shock, yet it didn't instantly make me terrified or shrink away in fright. Instead, it felt almost as though reality hadn't quite caught up yet. The reason was likely sensorially numbing exhaustion. Simply getting from Japan to Lima took nearly 2 days, the majority of which was spent strapped into an airplane seat, leaving me thoroughly exhausted by the time we reached the hotel. Traveling from Haneda Airport to Narita International Airport, taking my first trip abroad from San Jose to Los Angeles, staying overnight and proceeding via Miami to Lima International Airport. Upon arrival, domestic terrorism was ongoing, and the glimpses of the landscape looked like the devastated scenery of post-World War II Japan. The preceding days were by no means my familiar living environment before departure, but rather a world that could be called extraordinary, and because the process of moving through it far exceeded the rhythm and scope of daily life. It was only natural that the surprising sights around the hotel entrance felt somehow alien, otherworldly, and entirely devoid of consensus with my life up to that point. After routine check-in formalities were finished, I looked around and saw Edward and simultaneous interpreter Hoshina still lingering in the lobby. Feeling slightly self-conscious, I decided to ask about the UFO I had seen on the plane. According to him, UFOs sometimes follow alongside airplanes flying at high altitude. They also seemed somewhat surprised that tour participants had witnessed a UFO from the airplane window before even reaching Peru. Personally, I felt an impulse to ask Edward in more detail about the UFO, but I used strong willpower to suppress it, thinking it out of place to detain them any further and force a prolonged standing conversation when other opportunities would surely arise, so I stepped away from them. My roommate, Tadashi, worried about cholera, brushed his teeth with carbonated Perrier water. This was another first for me. The strange world of brushing one's teeth with carbonated Perrier felt a little comical. We ate cup ramen prepared with a small travel cooker we had brought along, drank coffee, chatted about stories from our design work environments, and laughed until exhaustion naturally brought on sleep. He wasn't prickly or difficult like the local cameramen I knew, nor did he possess a shred of the arrogance often seen in artistic types. He was extremely friendly, and I thought he had enough humor and comedic talent to pass as a manze partner firing off jokes continuously. I began to find it wonderfully refreshing how much I started laughing myself while spending time with Tadashi. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archive Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3, The First Contact. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of real-life experiences, perfect for your daily plunge into consciousness exploration. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Share your thoughts on today's episode.